All right, good morning. You may think that this series on the divided kingdoms of Israel is going to go on forever. And I'll tell you, it could. But just to put your mind at rest, we will end on the 19th of February. Next week, we will do Elisha all the way to the end of Israel when Assyria carried them off. And then the week after, we'll do Hezekiah and the revival that he led. And then after that, we'll do Josiah and the end of Jerusalem when it was destroyed in 586. So that's kind of what we're covering. You'll see that today we're going to talk about Judah's nightmare. Those are the passages that are relevant in 2 Chronicles, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. And Israel's nightmare, this happens every week. Okay, I call it the nightmare. It's this period between two righteous kings, Jehoshaphat and Joash, when things got really bad. And even there, it wasn't quite over because these two righteous kings, and maybe the third, actually toward the end of their life, they're orange, which means they kind of fell away. And the culture of murder and mayhem was imported from Ahab's family, and it engulfed this whole period. So it's a terrible story. It's an interesting story, fascinating in so many ways. We started out going from Rehoboam all the way to Jehoshaphat in the southern kingdom called Judah. And then we backed up, we went to the rebel Jeroboam, and then we worked our way down to Ahab. And of course, with Ahab, you are talking about Elijah, okay? So that's been where we've been up to this point. But once you get to that point, the story gets jumbled. And the reason it gets jumbled is because Ahab and Jehoshaphat mingled their families, and it affected everything thereafter. They too became related by marriage. They went on business ventures together, joint ventures. They fought wars as allies one with another, many times unnecessarily. And the sad thing about this whole thing is that the values of Jehoshaphat, who was a righteous king, who taught his people the law of Moses, who tried very hard to keep Judah from wandering away to idolatry, the values of Jehoshaphat did not affect the values of Ahab. Rather, it went the opposite direction. And that's as you would expect. I was writing my notes and I said, as you would expect. Why would you expect that? Terry.
Well, years ago, I heard Chuck say, you put a white glove on your hand and you stir it around in the mud. The glove always gets muddy, but the mud never gets glovey.
Well, that's pretty, it's glovey. Okay, like that. That's good. Yeah, that's good. Sure. It's human nature, isn't it? As a matter of fact, the big political divide in America between conservatives and progressives is largely the result of two different views of human nature. The Christian view of human nature, or the rational view, as some conservatives would say, is that human nature has flaws. It's flawed. It's limited. It has a tendency to do evil. In flying airplanes, there's all these little switches, you got to throw toggles. Well, some of them have a spring in them so that when you turn the switch, it goes back to where it started. It's called spring-loaded. And we used to say some people are spring-loaded to self-destruct. And humanity is kind of that way. And so that brings out the danger of becoming entangled with the enemies of God. Now, the first hint of trouble that we hear of is in the life of Jehoshaphat. It's where he's introduced, and it's his first evaluation verse. Jack, let's look at that. We'll be in 1 Kings 21 and 22 for a little bit. Then we'll go to 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. So 21, 25.
There was never a man like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, urged on by Jezebel, his wife.
All right. There was never a man like Ahab who sold himself to do evil, and he was pushed by his wife Jezebel. Jezebel was the daughter and a priest of Baal, which was Canaanite idol worship, the whole bit where you put your children through the fire and all sorts of horrible things. And he was pushed by his wife, and he was evil himself. So this guy is not just a bad king, he's incredibly evil. And so we get the first of Jehoshaphat's evaluation in chapter 22, just one chapter down, verses 43 to 44.
In everything, he walked in the ways of his father Asa and did not stray from them. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. The high places, however, were not removed, and the people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. Jehoshaphat was also at peace with the king of Israel.
That's interesting, that verse 44, isn't it? Jehoshaphat was also at peace with the king of Israel. I don't think that's said in any other king's evaluation. And it's the first hint that there's trouble ahead. I mean, what was the son of David, the king of Judah, the one who's God's man, doing at peace with God's enemy? You know, somebody told me that they were talking with missionaries and saying, what do the Chinese think is the difference between Chinese Christians and Americans? And the answer was quick. It says, you don't know you're at war. You just don't know that you're at war. You think everything's cool, and it's not. And so this is the first hint that I can see that Jehoshaphat was going to run into trouble because he made peace with the northern kingdom that was God's enemy. Now, he was truly one of the great kings. Like we can't fault him too much. He was a great king. He did right in the eyes of the Lord. He just allowed himself to be at peace. And then he got further than that, and he began to get entangled with these truly evil rulers. Nothing wrong with being at peace generically. I mean, we want to be at peace with Russia. We want to be at peace with everybody we can. But he went beyond that. He actually intermarried his family. We'll see that in a minute. He became entangled. I think that he actually really liked Ahab. Ahab was not this wicked, evil, monster. He was a pretty fun guy. We see Jehoshaphat feasting with him and having a good old time. We see him giving his son in marriage to Ahab's daughter. We see him going to the beautiful city of Samaria. Remember, Jehoshaphat lives in the old city of Jerusalem, which is pretty musty and old by this time. And then Ahab's father had built this wonderful city called Samaria, which was all the modern, glittering, progressive stuff you could ever ask for. And so it was a lot of fun to be up there, and I'm sure he liked that. But all along the way in his life, there were flags, red flags, that tell him that there's trouble. And a lot of trouble came to Jehoshaphat. But I think if you ask Jehoshaphat, well, what about this failure? What about this trouble? You're getting in trouble with this family. I think he would have said, well, it's nothing I can't handle. And that was true. That was true. It wasn't much that he couldn't handle, but the big dividends were to come in his children. And there's a lesson there for us. Some people have said the sins that the parents tolerate may well be indulged into excess by their children. Leonard.
Ahab still was Jewish. I mean, he was the king of Israel, Jehoshaphat, Judah. So Jehoshaphat's son married Ahab's daughter. From a boss standpoint, that was an appropriate marriage.
Oh, yeah. I mean, as far as that was concerned. So I think that God is going, for example, your son could marry a wicked woman. She's an American. She's human. As long as it's a woman, you can get married. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong with it in your view if he did?
Well, I think first things first, the important measure for us would be our children to marry other Christians.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would be important to us. Same thing with Jehoshaphat. It would be important Jehoshaphat's son to marry a Jewish woman, and he did.
Well, he didn't violate the law by doing that, Gigi.
I think it's an example for us to be careful of the world. I mean, all the pleasures of the world, the fun stuff was something that could drag him down and his family, and he, I guess, chose to ignore it.
And it goes beyond. In other words, the point is, it goes beyond the letter of the law.
It goes way beyond the letter of the law to good judgment about. Well, Proverbs tells us that evil companions corrupt good morals. And we need to be kept separate from the world. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along too. So anyway, the consequences that came out of that were horrible, and they went mostly to his successors. Now, we're going to cover a number of kings and one queen, Athaliah, and then these kings over here in this story. It's a little difficult to tell. You'll notice that there's some confusing names. For example, you have Jehoram, king of Judah, Joram, king of Israel, which you say, what's wrong with that? The fact that Jehoram is another form of Joram, and sometimes he's called Joram, and sometimes he's called Jehoram. So it gets confusing. You have Ahaziah, king of Judah, Ahaziah, his uncle, king of Israel. I put an N for north and an S for south to help me keep them straight. And then you got Athaliah, I say. You would say, well, if Ahaziah is Aya, why wouldn't she be Athaliah? Well, you're right. But I think Athaliah sounds more like a girl, so it helps me remember she's a queen. So, and then there's a Joash on both sides, except he was a prince. He wasn't a king, and there's a Joash here. So it gets a little bit confusing, and perhaps that was an indication of their familial relationship. You know, Ahaziah could well have been named after his uncle, and Joram could have been named for his brother-in-law, who was much older. So, you know, that tends to muddy the water a little bit. But Judah's nightmare is this particular gap right here. And unfortunately, it actually continued to affect the good kings that came after. Now, telling the story is difficult because the accounts are mixed up and they're all over the place and fragmented in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles. So I've tried to pull them together and to tell the story as clearly as I possibly can. And I'll find out at lunch today whether or not I got it right. Now, during his lifetime, Jehoshaphat had a lot of dealings, a lot of positive, friendly dealings with Ahab. That's why I put the green line there, okay? And they of course, they became family. In 1 Kings 21, oh, excuse me, I'm looking at the wrong verse. Sorry. What he did is he married his son, the crown prince Jehoram, to Ahab's daughter Athaliah. Now, realize that there are loads and loads of other children in the royal family, because if you have 26 wives, you're going to have a lot of children. And so these are the ones that are count in our story. You have Ahab 3 children: Athaliah, a woman; Ahaziah, who was the crown prince, became king; Joram, his brother; and then of course you have Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram. Okay, so so they had a lot of interaction. He marries. We get that in 2 Kings 8:18. Jack?
He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done before, for he married a daughter of Ahab. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord.
Okay, Joram, Jehoshaphat's son, king of Judah, marries Ahab's daughter Athaliah. Now, it's bad enough he called his mother-in-law, Jezebel, his mother-in-law, and that's bad enough. But Athaliah seems to have been a little bit like her mother. So that's one link that they got. In 1 Kings 18, we then see him drinking and feasting with Ahab in Samaria. 1 Kings 22, 1-4.
For 3 years, there was no war between Aram and Israel, but in the 3rd year, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went down to see the king of Israel. The king of Israel had said to his officials, "Don't you know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us, and yet we are doing nothing to retake it from the king of Aram?" So he asked Jehoshaphat, "Will you go with me to fight against Ramoth Gilead?" Jehoshaphat replied to the king of Israel, "I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses."
Well, now you begin to see how this relationship is developing. It's a rather one-sided relationship. We see that they're having a great time in Samaria. They're drinking, they're feasting. And Ahab, we went through this in great detail in a previous lesson, but just to remind you, he's having a good time with Jehoshaphat. He says, "Hey, Jehoshaphat, that city, Jabesh Gilead, belongs to us. We ought to go get it back from King Ben-Hadad. And what do you say? Don't you think we should get that back?" And Jehoshaphat doesn't know what to say. And so he turns to all the nobles and the people that are sitting around it. "Wouldn't you all agree here's to Jabesh Gilead. They all throw their glass up. And he says, what do you say, Jehoshaphat? Well, Jehoshaphat's under pressure, isn't he? He's going to get pressured into this thing. There's no reason in the world for him to pick a fight with the most powerful kingdom to his north. But he goes along with Ahab, who decides to pick a fight, break the peace, and disaster ultimately ensues. So he pressures him into picking a fight. And then when they get into battle, he sets up Jehoshaphat as the target, because Ahab knows that the military doctrine of the Arameans is you go for the king, decapitate the regime, look for the guy in the royal robes with the flags and the big chariot, and everybody focus on that one goal and kill him. So Ahab says, well, I'm going to go disguised, be with my men. And you go ahead and take your chariot and your big rich robes, and you command the battle from the hilltop where they can see you. And of course, that caused the Arameans to go flying after Jehoshaphat. He darn nearly lost his life. And he ends up fleeing back to Jerusalem. Ahab ends up getting killed in the battle. So this friendship, it seems to be kind of a one-way thing, doesn't it? Well, why don't you come help me pick a fight with this guy so I can get rich? And listen, oh, by the way, I'm going to go disguise. I want you to be the target. That's the kind of relationship that he had during his own life. And you never hear in other battles that Judah chose to fight, you never hear of Israel coming to Judah's aid. It's only a couple times now we hear Israel asking Judah, why don't you come help me get rich? And Jehoshaphat yields in this case. Now, after Ahab dies, okay, his son Ahaziah becomes the king, and he only lasts about 2 years. But we do hear that Jehoshaphat pursues a joint venture with Ahaziah. We're going to build a fleet of ships. We're going to all take those ships and go out together, and we're going to go to Ophir, and we're going to bring back a whole bunch of gold, just like Solomon, our great-great-great-great-grandfather, did. And so he makes this alliance, and God condemns him for it. In 2 Chronicles 20, verse 37, there's a prophet named Eleazar who says to him, Jehoshaphat, because you have made an alliance with Ahaziah, the Lord will destroy what you have made. The ships were wrecked and were never able to set sail to trade. So here we have a whole fleet of ships. We don't know how they were destroyed. Could have been a fire. Could have been maybe when they were out sailing and getting ready that they had a big storm and they were sunk. Could have lost a lot of men. Certainly lost a lot of money. And God condemns him, not for building ships, but for what? For an alliance with Ahaziah. He condemns him for that. Now, Ahaziah dies of an illness, and we aren't going to spend any more time on him, just except to say he's the last thing that Elijah was involved with before he left. Do you remember the story? Elijah sitting on a hilltop, and Ahaziah tries to command him to come see him. The king commands you come. And he sends a company of cavalry up, or of infantry up there, and Elijah calls down fire, destroys them. He sends another, God calls down fire, he destroys them. And then the last one, the third company to go up there and call him down to the king, it sort of goes up there like this. He says, please don't hurt us. We just want you to think about, coming down, maybe, if you will, please, sir. And so then he goes with them. And Amaziah is condemned to die of a disease, and he does. He dies. So Ahaziah now has no children. He's too young, apparently, or something. And so who's going to be the king? And there we go. Do you know how well this works when I'm testing it in the morning, and then it never works when we get together? There's something about the aura here, I guess. I don't know. But Joram now becomes the king of the northern kingdom. That's not Jehoram, that's Joram, okay? And he becomes the king of the northern kingdom. Jehoshaphat's still on the throne. Jehoshaphat still hasn't learned from his lesson, right? And so we have a situation where Joram asks Jehoshaphat, can we go to war? Now, if you remember our story of Jehoshaphat, the kings of the east, that would include Moab and Edom, had attacked him with a vast and huge army. And God himself delivered them. They never had to lift a finger or a spear. And God destroyed them in what's called the Valley of Jehoshaphat. So Jehoshaphat had won a great victory over Moab, and it was a defensive victory. It couldn't be blamed. And Moab was at peace. And now good old Joram says, look, they owe me 100,000 lambs a year, plus the wool from another 100,000 lambs every year as tribute, and they stopped paying. Why don't you come with me so I can get rich again? You hear the kind of same pattern? So let's read about it a little bit in 2 Kings 3, 5-7.
But after Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So at that time, King Joram set out from Samaria and mobilized all Israel. He also sent this message to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight against Moab? I will go with you, he replied. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses.
Now, if you go back to chapter 22 of 1 Kings, you'll hear those are the same words exactly that Jehoshaphat used when Ahab asked him to go pick a fight with Aram. He says, I am as you are, my men are your men, my horses are your horses. It's a foolish thing to do. It was an absolutely unnecessary war for Jehoshaphat, and it caused him a lot of grief. So anyway, they go out into the desert together. Okay, he's helping Joram, right? And they go out into the desert and they wander around and they get lost and they're running out of water and the army is going to starve to death, and they're in a real pickle. And so what does Joram do? 2 Kings 3, 9-10.
So the king of Israel set out with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. After a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for the animals with them. What? Exclaimed the king of Israel. Has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to hand us over to Moab?
Wait a minute. Who called the 3 kings together? Joram did. And it was so he could get rich, so he could get the money back. And he's blaming Jehoshaphat's God, the Lord, for this. He does this again later on. Now, there happens to be a prophet present that we know. His name's Elisha. I don't know why he was with the army, but he was. And so Jehoshaphat says, we need to talk to Elisha. Elijah says, I'm not talking to you. He's not interested. You guys are a bunch of idiots. But he says, for the sake of Jehoshaphat, I will. And so we see that in 2 Kings 3, verse 14.
Elisha said, as surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I did not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not look at you or even notice you.
If I didn't have respect for Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't even notice you guys. So Elisha then, he says, bring me a harp, and then he goes into a trance or something, and the Holy Spirit speaks through him and tells them they're going to be delivered, and they are delivered. God provides water. But then they go and they slaughter the people of Moab. Not only do they kill them in a bloody battle, they fill up the wells, destroy their source of water, burn their crops, destroy their source of grain and food, leave them in a starvation situation. It's obvious they're not going to pay any tribute. So it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory, and it was a disgrace. And the way the battle ends is that the king of Moab finally brings his firstborn crown prince son to the top of the wall, and he kills him as a sacrifice to his God. And it so nauseates everybody that the armies of Israel and Judah retreat and go back home. Now, what did Jehoshaphat get out of this? He got a black eye. He got a mortal enemy for the rest of his life. And he was guilty of a horrible crime in warfare. It's just sad to see that happens. Now, we're going to switch from Kings. We're going to jump to 2 Chronicles 21, and we'll be there at 21, 22 for a while, all the way to 25. And the reason I say that is a lot of those chapters are exact duplicates of what you find in Kings. So we'll just decide to stick with 2 Chronicles. Now, Jehoshaphat has had all these troubles, but he's still a righteous king, okay? But he's invited into his family, Athaliah, daughter of Ahab. He's got a close working relationship with Ahab's family, and he dies and is succeeded by his firstborn son, Jehoram. Now, in 2 Chronicles 21, 1-3, it tells us how he prepares for his death and succession.
Then
Jack?
Jehoshaphat rested with his fathers and was buried with them in the city of David. And Jehoram, his son, succeeded him as king. Jehoram's brothers, the sons of Jehoshaphat, were Azariah, Jehiel, Zechariah, Azariah, Michael, and Shephatiah. All these were the sons of Jehoshaphat, king of Israel. Their father had given them many gifts of silver and gold and articles of value, as well as fortified cities in Judah, but he had given the kingdom to Jehoram because he was his firstborn son.
I love giving these verses with all the names to Jack because he does such a great job. Most of us would go, yeah, whatever. Okay, now, so now, what am I saying? So Jehoshaphat is still on the throne. We did the Moab thing. Oh, here we are. Sorry. Now Jehoshaphat dies. He succeeded. Now, when his first son Jehoram ascends the throne, you'd think that this should be all hunky-dory because Jehoshaphat had provided for his other sons a source of revenue, given them cities, given them gifts, given them silver, provided for them, and then made Jehoram the first born, his crown prince, the king. What does Jehoram do? And well, let's read verses 4-7, Jack.
When Jehoram established himself firmly over his father's kingdom, he put all his brothers to the sword, along with some of the princes of Israel. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for he married a daughter of Ahab. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Nevertheless, because of the covenant the Lord had made with David, the Lord was not willing to destroy the house of David. He had promised to maintain a lamp for him and his descendants forever.
Now, this is amazing. The son of Jehoshaphat, such a righteous king, has been given the kingdom. His brothers have been taken care of. And what does he do? He kills every one of his brothers. And this is the beginning of the practice of assassination in the palace that was imported from Ahab's side to Israel. And you'll see in this long night, if you remember, there were those dark red boxes. Those are all violent deaths. And they all take place in Judah because they have imported from Ahab this ethic of killing your rivals and assassinating them. So that's bad enough. But then after that, after all the good that Jehoshaphat had done to deliver the southern kingdom of Judah to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to the law of Moses, he undoes it all and he wrecks it. And it looks to me like Athaliah was undoubtedly filling the role of Jezebel. She was hunting down the prophets of the Lord. She was killing them. She was oppressing the priests in the Temple of Solomon. The Temple of Solomon was basically neglected. It was starting to fall apart. And she tried to introduce people to the Baals like Jezebel did in the northern kingdom. And in fact, we read later on, once Joash becomes king, we read that there's a temple to Baal in Jerusalem. Well, she was pretty quick to do that. And it shows you that Baal worship was brought in by her. Now, Jehoram, his reign was an unmitigated disaster. You just read that all in the next chapter. And all his tributaries revolted. He was nearly killed fleeing the Edomites at night. The Philistines and the Arabs from the south came up and they invaded and they sacked the city. They not only did that, they killed all of his sons, but the youngest, and they took all of his wives and all of his treasure. Then he was so bad that Elijah, now Elijah is the prophet in the northern kingdom, right? He sends a letter to the southern kingdom. And we read of it in 2 Chronicles 21, 12-15.
Jehoram received a letter from Elijah the prophet, which said, quote, "This is what the Lord, the God of your father David, says. You have not walked in the ways of your father Jehoshaphat or of Asa, king of Judah, but you have walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and you have led Judah and the people of Jerusalem to prostitute themselves, just as the house of Ahab did. You have also murdered your own brothers, members of your father's house, men who were better than you. So now the Lord is about to strike your people, your sons, your wives, and everything that is yours with a heavy blow. You yourself will become very ill with a lingering disease of the bowels until the disease causes your bowels to come out.
Ugh. Yeah. And in fact, he eventually does die of this intestinal order that causes his intestines to invert, which must have been just gross as could be. And then he died. And it's an interesting verse that describes his death, chapter 21, verse 20. I love this verse. Want to read that, Jack?
Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. He passed away to no one's regret and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings.
Now, a measure of respect is if you were buried in the city of David, and even greater respect in among the tombs of the kings. But this one says he died and he was gone to nobody's regret. So he was a bum. And of course, that hurt the nation. Now, Jehoram was this disaster, right? And the Arabs, remember, he killed all his brothers, so he was the only heir, but he had all these children, right? Oh, except the Arabs and the Philistines came in and they slaughtered all his children but one. So he has to, he brings his, okay, there we go. His son Ahaziah is young. He's, I think, 22 years old. He only lasts about a year. And he has a daughter named Jehosheba. There are other children, perhaps, that were women, but that's the only son that we know of. And so he ends up on the throne. And, pardon me? I thought somebody had a question. Okay. Like his dad, it says he follows the ways of the house of Ahab, ruled by the queen mother Athaliah, and his father's advisors. 2 Chronicles 22, 2-3.
Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 1 year. His mother's name was Athaliah, a granddaughter of Omri. He too walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother encouraged him in doing wrong.
So here you have, just like Jezebel pushed her husband Ahab to do evil and to worship the Baals, Athaliah is doing the same thing to Jehoram, and together they're making a real mess of the whole thing. But now notice something. Athaliah is the queen mother over Amaziah. He only lasts 1 year. Now there's going to be a big scramble for the succession when Ahaziah dies, okay? And what is Athaliah going to do? And how does Ahaziah die? Well, we've seen the story before. What happens is he goes to visit his uncle, Ahaziah. Sorry. Excuse me, his uncle Joram. Ahaziah, south, king of Judah, goes to visit his uncle Joram, who is the king of Israel, who is recuperating from his wounds in the city of Jezreel. He had been at war with Aram and he was wounded. So he goes there. And as soon as he gets there, he finds himself in the middle of Jehu's bloody rebellion that we went over last week. Jehu tells us of the 2 Chronicles 22, 7-9 tells us of the death of Ahaziah, king of Judah, by Jehu.
Through Ahaziah's visit to Joram, God brought about Ahaziah's downfall. When Ahaziah arrived, he went out with Joram to meet Jehu, son of Nimshi, whom the Lord had anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. While Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab, he found the princes of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's relatives who had been attending Ahaziah, and he killed them. He then went in search of Ahaziah, and his men captured him while he was hiding in Samaria. He was brought to Jehu and put to death. They buried him, for they said, he was a son of Jehoshaphat who sought the Lord with all his heart. So there was no one in the house of Ahaziah powerful enough to retain the kingdom.
Wow. Remember that story? Jehu is going to instigate a coup against the king. His king is Joram. He's been given an anointment to destroy the house of Ahab, and so he does so, and justifiably so. And he comes roaring from Jezreel, from Jabesh Gilead over to Jezreel, and they look out from the wall and they said, "Who's that guy out there?" Well, he's driving like a maniac. It must be Jehu. And they send out a couple of messengers who don't come back. And so as soon as Ahaziah, king of Judah, goes to visit Joram, king of Israel, they ride out together to meet Jehu. After all, he's one of their generals. And of course, Jehu assassinates them both. What happens is Jehu says, "You're a wicked man, I'm going to kill you." And he says, "Treachery, treachery." He turns his chariot around to go away. And as soon as he turns his back, Jehu pulls his bow and he shoots an arrow right through his back, right through his heart, and he's dead. And they throw his body on the grounds of Naboth the Jezreelite, where Ahab had been cursed. Remember that? Okay. And then he goes on and he destroys Jezebel and he destroys the people of Baal and so forth. But Ahaziah is a little bit different. He's from Judah, right? And so he turns to run and they wound him, but he goes and he spends some time in Megiddo and in Samaria. He's hiding in Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, from Jehu, and they find him. And so they bring him to Jehu and he kills him right there on the spot. Now, it's interesting because this was sad and unnecessary. God had not told Jehu to wipe out the house of David. He told him to wipe out the house of Ahab. And in fact, later on in Hosea, it tells us that God later punished Jehu's descendants for going beyond their writ. He had gone beyond and killed the king of Judah. So this was an unnecessary death. But now Judah is without a king. Remember, Ahaziah is the only child of Jehoram. And if he has any children, one of them is going to become the king. And Athaliah realizes if some child of some other woman in the harem becomes the king, what happens to her? She loses all her power, right? She's essentially running the country through her 22-year-old son, Ahaziah. He's just gotten killed. What's she going to do? Well, you can imagine what she's going to do in the classic Ahab family. She decides to kill off anybody else in the royal family of the house of David. So let's read about it in 22:10.
When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family of the house of Judah.
She destroys all the children of Ahaziah, and that would include her grandchildren. And she decides to make herself the queen. And she rules Judah for 6 miserable years. Now, here is a daughter of Ahab from the northern kingdom ruling the southern kingdom instead of the line of David. That's a usurper, isn't it? And you can imagine what went on when it was Athaliah in control. She thinks at this point that she's eliminated all claims of the house of David to the throne, right? And she may also have thought that she could do a deal with Jehu and they might merge the two kingdoms and they would reach the holy grail of a united Israel again. So she's got a lot of power politics going on. But God had said that David's kingdom would last forever, right? And his line would never be put out. His lamp would never be put out. And so he has other plans. Now, what happens, we get in 2 Chronicles 22, 11 and 12.
But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered, and put him and his nurse in a bedroom, because Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram and wife of the priest Jehoiada, was Ahaziah's sister. She hid this child from Athaliah so she could not kill him. He remained hidden with them at the temple of God for 6 years, while Athaliah ruled in the land.
Now, here we have 2 heroes introduced. One is Jehosheba, and she's Ahaziah's sister, a daughter of Jehoram, okay? And you can imagine the soldiers under Athaliah's command are going through the palace. The harem's got, let's just say there's 27 wives or so, and that means there may be as many as 30, 40 children that are below, teenagers, are majority, the little children. and they're going through and they're killing all of them. Can you imagine the chaos in the palace? Screaming, running, carrying on. They've got them surrounded. Anybody that helps tries to preserve them is killed themselves. And this little gal, Jehoshaphat, whoever she was, she grabs the youngest infant, Joash, and takes him into the bedroom, hides him under the bed until she can get out of there, and then takes him to the temple. She is the wife of another hero, and his name is Jehoiada. Jehoiada is the chief priest at the Temple of Solomon. Remember, he's out of favor, right? What's Athaliah doing? She's bringing Baal worship in. She's got a separate temple. The temple of the Lord is being run down and neglected, and nothing's much is going on over there. So it's a pretty good place to hide. And so she brings him to the protection of her husband and herself in the old Temple of Solomon. And that's where he hides for 6 years. Now, chapter 23 will describe the coup that Jehoiada engineers to bring the son of David back to the throne. And it's fascinating if you study it. First of all, he realizes he's got the only heir to the throne of David. He's got the only one. And he's got him hidden in this old temple, and nobody's doing much there. You know, they're all out there celebrating with Baal, and Athaliah, I call her, has basically cordoned it off, and nobody gets in there. So it's a quiet place. It's musty, it's old, it's fallen apart, but it's a good place to hide. And he keeps him there. And then he begins to go out into the countryside, and he gathers support among the priests, the Levites, the heads of the major families, and the army leaders, the commanders. So he just visits each one. He says, look, would you support bringing the king of David, David's son, back to the throne? And he gets them all to an assembly. And I think they had the assembly in the temple in secret. And all these people who are in on the deal assemble there. And in chapter 23, verse 3, tells what they do.
When they came to Jerusalem, the whole assembly made a covenant with the king at the temple of God. Jehoiada said to them, the king's son shall reign, as the Lord promised concerning the descendants of David. So
these folks have now made a secret covenant that they would see to it that the son of Ahaziah would reign on David's throne instead of Athaliah, which means he's engineering a coup, right? Now, he executes his plan using priests and Levites. I can't read every verse on this, but it's really cool. These priests and these Levites, they go on and off shifts. They have different, groups that go on and off. So as to prevent anybody from thinking something's going on, he plans to use the off-going shift and the oncoming shift at the same time. So he doesn't release the off-going shift, keeps them in the temple, and he brings the ongoing shift. Now he's got a critical mass, okay? So while he's got these folks in here, he's got to get some weapons because they're not the army. So what does he do? He goes back into the museum in the temple where all the old shields and swords and spears that belonged to David, I mean, they were like 150 years old. And he pulls them out and he arms all of the priests and the Levites. Nobody knows this is going on. The temple has been sealed off. As a matter of fact, they put guards at the temple door, Levites that won't let anybody in because they say, you must be consecrated. And since you're not consecrated, the law of Moses says you can't come in here. So they're doing all this in secret, okay? And then they get things ready. After he passes out the weapons, he then brings the young boy in and he presents him with the crown and, interestingly, a copy of the covenant. Now, the copy of the covenant would probably have been Deuteronomy, in which God covenants with the Israelites to be their God if they would be his people. And they declare him king. 2 Chronicles 23, 10 to 13.
He stationed all the men, each with his weapon in his hand, around the king, near the altar and the temple, from the south side to the north side of the temple. Jehoiada and his sons brought out the king's son and put the crown on him. They presented him with a copy of the covenant and proclaimed him king. They anointed him and shouted, "Long live the king!" When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and cheering the king, she went to the temple she went to them at the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets, and singers with musical instruments were leading the praises. Then Athaliah tore her robes and shouted, "Treason! Treason!"
You get the irony of that, by the way? You can hear this witch, yelling out, "Treason, you!" Well, I think the way this works, if you're trying to imagine it, the palace is not the same thing as the temple, right? So this is all going on in the temple. The temple's been kind of out of the way, not part of her world, but she hears this huge commotion because once they've done this, they've invited all the common people in. They're celebrating. They're talking, we have the King of David on the throne again. And she just hears a lot of noise. And I think she's arrogant and she's pretty confident. And she just goes down there with her little entourage of assistants and she walks, "What's going on here anyway?" And then she realizes she's been had. And they have brought this king out and she's got a coup on her hands. And she yells, "Treason!" And she turns and she runs. And Jehoiada says to the soldiers, or his Levites, he said, "Don't kill her in the temple, but kill her." And so they run after her, and it says they caught her at the horse gate. Now, I imagine that the horse gate is the place where the cavalry would enter into the courtyard of the palace. And so she's trying desperately to get back to the security of the palace and all of her soldiers where she could mount resistance, and they catch her just before she gets in there. And then they kill her right then and right there. And they declare that Joash is now the king. He's only 7 years old, but he is now the king. Now, they don't stop there. Okay. In 2 Chronicles 23, 16 to 18. What does that say?
Jehoiada then made a covenant that he and the people and the king would be the Lord's people. All the people went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They smashed the altars and idols and killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. Then Jehoiada placed the oversight of the temple of the Lord in the hands of the priests who were Levites, to whom David had made assignments in the temple, to present the burnt offerings of the Lord as written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and singing, as David had ordered.
I love this verse 16. Jehoiada is an amazing leader. Not only has he led this coup, he now makes a covenant that says that he himself, the people, and the king, the warrior right next to him, would be the Lord's people. And I think, when it's time to clean house in any aspect of our lives, we need to decide, are we going to be the Lord's people? And we need then to take our temples of Baal and put them out of business. And that's what they do. So they destroy the temple of Baal, they tear it down, they kill the priest in front of his own altars. And it says then that the nation rejoices. It is at peace. 23:21, Jack.
And all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet because Athaliah had been slain with the sword.
Now, it's interesting because I've told you that every single king on that two lists of kings, with the exception of one who lasted a couple of days, have an evaluation verse. In other words, the Spirit of God has put in there an evaluation. Are they good or are they bad guys? Did they do evil in the sight of the Lord? Did they do good in the sight of the Lord? Was their heart right with God? And everyone has an evaluation verse. Athaliah doesn't get one. This is as close as you get. God ignores her completely in the narrative as far as saying what he thought of her. All the people of the land rejoiced. The city was calm because she had been slain. How'd you like that? There's that verse that says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." And there's another one that says, "When the wicked rule, the people moan. But when the righteous rule, there's light." And that's true. And so here we say that finally this thing has been expunged, she has been destroyed, and we have good leadership. And we're bringing the people back to the Lord. Now, all of this is a bloody story. And that's on top of last week, which was a bloodier story. This is hard for us to conceive of because in those days, the world was unspeakably cruel. We like to think that we're not. Of course, all you have to do is look at the bombing of Dresden or Hiroshima or so many other places where we slaughter people with mechanical efficiency. But it truly, personally, there was a lot of blood and guts. So what's the point of what we're saying here? What's the lesson that this story, beginning with Jehoshaphat, working its way all the way down, the effect of his alliance with Ahab and his entangling of his family with Ahab, what's the message? Can you draw anything from it? Well, yeah, Lynn?
I have a couple, I was looking at this, particularly Athaliah, and you have to ask yourself a couple of questions. Number one, why didn't she receive an evaluation? And I think, number one, she was illegitimate in that position. She didn't deserve, she didn't deserve one. Secondly, why is it two things? Why was it that she was never going to be successful? She was almost successful in what she wanted to do, but she wasn't completely successful. And that girl took care of and rescued Joash. Okay, so why wasn't she successful? And I think thirdly, why did God tolerate all of this mess? And I think number one, it shows us that left to our own devices, we can get pretty evil and pretty messy.
Yeah.
Number two, Athaliah was never going to be successful because God's line, Jesus, was going to come from the house of Judah, and Judah had to persist.
House of David.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But David was Jesus was the tribe of Judah. So essentially that wasn't going to happen. And ultimately it tells us and should encourage us in the midst of turmoil, whether we have legitimate leaders or illegitimate leaders, as bad as things get, God ultimately will show his face and be in control. And I think that's the message to us.
Yeah, amen. I think I mentioned this in the past, that when the O.J. Simpson verdict came down, people asked me, aren't you upset with this? People were really uptight because they thought that was an unjust verdict. And I said, I would be if I didn't believe that ultimately God will bring perfect justice to this world, and he will. But another thing I think is that there is a real danger to being unequally yoked with those who are God's enemies. And I think we need to be careful of that. We are at war. There is a spiritual war, and we ought to take that into account when we marry, when we go into business relationships, when we get involved closely with people who are God's enemies. In 2 Corinthians 6:14-18, Paul says this. We're all familiar with the verse, but he quotes a passage from the Old Testament. Jack, would you read that for us, please?
Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? What does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Therefore, come out from them and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you. I will be a father to you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty.
There is a danger to being unequally yoked. God warns us of that. Does that mean we retreat to a monastery or we become hermits? No. There's this concept of being in the world, but not of the world, isn't there? And there's some difficult decisions that we have to make. What does it mean to be yoked? What does it mean to be separate? How do we negotiate our way through that? But the principle is always there. We are not of the world. We are God's children, born of the Holy Spirit, and we are sent into the world to be a light that dispels the darkness, not be overcome by it. Second thing on this is that there is a generational cost to evil and to this sort of error that Jehoshaphat fell into. It wasn't very much a problem for Jehoshaphat. He got through it all, right? He died a natural death, but everything after him was just a mess. because of what he imported into his family and what he linked up with, then there's a generational cost. In Exodus 34, Moses asks to see the glory of God, and God passes in front of him and holds him in the cleft of the rock. You've heard the song. Well, the interesting to me is there's no great big display of fire and wind like Elijah got. All there is words. And here are the words. Exodus 34, 6-7. This is God's glory. Jack?
And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation.
Now, I think the word punish there is more visits. There are other passages throughout the Bible that make it clear we don't punish your children for their parents' excesses and for their parents' sins. But God will visit the iniquity of fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. And that's exactly what happened here. And that tells you that we are responsible for an influence that extends from generation to generation. Karen.
And that's part of his glory. Moses asked for his glory to come.
Yes.
He talks about his mercy and he talks about his judgment as his glory.
And of course, it takes you to John chapter 3, where it says he is just, but he's also the justifier of those that believe. God, he is reconciled in Christ, this problem of being just and punishing sin and loving and being united with the sinner.
Mark?
Yeah.
75%. Now, I think this is still the figure. 75% of children whose parents are incarcerated will be incarcerated.
Yeah. There's a generational effect, and it goes on. Sometimes that is God's specific generational judgment. I mean, let's take it. God said, I'm going to tear the kingdom from your son, Solomon, because of your sin. Well, so Rehoboam, he had to live with the consequences of his dad's sin. And we see that all the time. Alcoholism, drug abuse, that will affect the children. But sometimes it's just a natural outworking of our sins. The things that we tolerate in moderation in our lives sometimes become the sins that conquer our children, and we should be careful. That's the lesson, as I see it, of that, all that blood and trouble. But now we get some good news. Joash goes on with his mentor Jehoiada, and he proceeds to rebuild Solomon's temple. I mean, it needed structural repair. It was falling apart. It's over 150 years old at this point. And so it's, everything's getting dingy and the curtains are messed up. And of course, they were able to hide in this place. But now the nation's coming back. And so they had to repair it. And Joash, with Jehoiada, repairs this thing. And it's really wonderful to see the way he does that, because not only was the temple falling apart from neglect, but Athaliah's sons had taken the sacred objects from the temple and thrown them into the temple of Baal. So he raised money from willing donations to the people. And I think, Len, you could tell me this, I think this is the first instance of philanthropic fundraising in the Bible. There you go. Okay. Well, then we're told that Jehoiada finally dies, and he's 130 years old. God kept him alive for the sake of the kingdom. 2 Chronicles 24, 15-16.
Now Jehoiada was old and full of years, and he died at the age of 130. He was buried with the kings in the city of David because of the good he had done in Israel for God and his temple.
This guy is a hero of Israel. He was not only buried in the city of David, he was buried with the kings. And he had been a strong influence on the boy king Joash. But unfortunately, Joash loses his bearings. In 2 Chronicles 24, verse 2, it says, if I can find it, here we go. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years of Jehoiada the priest. As long as he had his mentor, as long as he had leadership, he stayed on the right side of the border. But once that mentor was gone, he reverted to his family ways. 2 Chronicles 24, 17-18.
After the death of Jehoiada, The officials of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and he listened to them. They abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and worshipped Asherah poles and idols. Because of their guilt, God's anger came upon Judah and Jerusalem.
How quick, how fast things turn around. Not only that, but we read a little bit later on that Jehoiada's son is a prophet. He's named Zechariah. I don't think he's the one that wrote the book of Zechariah, but he's a prophet, Zechariah. And Zechariah pronounces judgment on him for what he is doing. And he doesn't like what he hears. And so Joash, who was saved, protected, crowned, and mentored by Jehoiada, murders his son. That's how low it could get. That's the lingering effect of this culture of assassinations that was brought over from the northern kingdom. Well, after that, things went to hell in a handcart. Judah was invaded by Aram. All the leaders were killed, the leaders of the country. And then Joash himself is assassinated by his own people. 2 Chronicles 24:25.
When the Arameans withdrew, they left Joash severely wounded. His officials conspired against him for murdering the son of Jehoiada the priest, and they killed him in his bed. So he was dead. So he died and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tomb of the kings.
So even though Joash, on balance, was considered a good king, and he did repair the temple, in his later life, he fell aside. He abandoned the Lord and he murdered his mentor's son, which is just despicable. And that tells you this culture stayed with Judah's kings for a while. And even down here, Uzziah, he became a leper at the end of his king. These kings are green also, but they aren't all that great. Hezekiah, of course, was a great king. Josiah was less, but he was also great. But other than that, things get pretty bad as you go down, and as you slide into the very end of the nation, things have gone downhill. And I think that had a lot to do with this story. We read the same thing. Yeah. Jay. Jay.
You notice who killed him?
His own officials.
Ammonites and Moabites. Remember those guys?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, he would have had they would have been his mortal enemies.
Blood for his sin.
Yeah. So you look at Amaziah, who's the king after Joash. He's a good king too, who had a bad ending. He's assassinated. You read that in 2 Chronicles 25:27, because he abandoned the Lord.
The account of his sons, the many prophecies about him, and the record of the restoration of the temple of God are written in the annotations of the book of the Kings. And Amaziah, his son, succeeded him as king.
So even after David's dynasty was restored, I would say they had nominally good kings reigning once again, but the nation never seemed to return to the way that it was prior to this. The nightmare of Judah actually affected the nation for the rest of its existence. It began a long period of decline. You had some revivals. Hezekiah and Josiah led some revivals, which were good, but they weren't what was prior to this time. And I imagine there's a lot of reasons for this decline, plenty of them. But I would say that much could have been prevented had, except for the verse in 1 Kings 22:44. What did it say, Jack?
Jehoshaphat was also at peace with the king of Israel.
Do we want to be at peace with the enemies of God? I don't think so. I think we ought to recognize the fact that we are on opposite sides. That doesn't mean we're obnoxious or we're wicked or we go around fighting wars, unless it's absolutely necessary. But by and large, we have to recognize we exist in a warfare. There is a conflict of the ages between good and evil, between God and Satan. And we are part of it. So I think we need to be careful that we don't make peace with the enemies of God.
I have a question